Hi, I'm Cherry.
And I'm Morgan, and we host the true crime podcast, Crimepedia, where we investigate unsolved crimes and cold cases from across the world.
We work with law enforcement and victims' families to help spread the word about cases that need more help.
So join us every Tuesday wherever you download your podcasts.
And follow us on social media. Just search for Crimepedia.
There was a lot of things like that where you'd think, what the
From Stuff, a new 12-part documentary podcast.
He was into sex every day.
The Commune. Sex, drugs, and a guru called Bert. There are crimes, but this isn't a whodunit, it's a why-done-it.
Good God, adults agreed to this?
The Commune. Find it now on your favourite podcast platform or at stuff.co.nz/The Commune.
You've already been welcomed to Centre Point.
Hi all, my name is Casey, host of the cultvaultpodcast, and in light of the recent US Supreme Court's decision to overturn the Roe v. Wade ruling, I have decided to host a 12-hour live stream on July the 22nd with an aim to raise funds for the Sound Choices Coalition, a non-profit helping people escape polygamy. I don't usually take a hard stance on political or religious opinions on this show, but I do fully believe, wholeheartedly, that women deserve to have complete autonomy over their own bodies, and that no one else should be able to dictate these things. I feel pretty strongly about this, but also pretty useless. I know I want to do something to contribute to the conversation and provide a safe space for people, so please consider joining on July the 22nd from 12 noon Eastern Time to 12 midnight on YouTube, Twitch and Twitter. Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today's discussion is the audio taken from the Patreon Live that I hosted back in the month of June, and it is in light of Spencer Schneider's book launch of his memoir Manhattan Cult Story that officially launches on July the 5th, that's this Friday. I will post a link in the episode description so you can order your very own copy, and I'm pleased to say that this book is also this month's monthly memoir. So by following me on social media, you can be entered in with a chance of winning yourself a signed copy from Spencer himself. We will be hosting regular Patreon exclusive sessions, and you can sign up from £1 a month at patreon.com/thecultvault. Also, any publishers or agents who are listening in, Esther is still on the market with her finished publication, so please reach out to me for her email address. If you haven't yet, I strongly advise listening back to episodes 141 with Spencer Schneider and 161 and 162 with Esther Friedman to better understand the conversation that we are having today. But without further ado, here is my conversation with Spencer and Esther. So hello patrons, and welcome to this special roundtable event with our extra special returning guests, Esther Friedman and Spencer Schneider. Although respectively, these individuals have experienced different branches of the same group, their experiences are both strangely similar and very different. Thank you both so much for agreeing to be here with me today, for taking the time to chat about your experiences with the patrons of my show. Esther, would you like to start by introducing yourself to the patrons?
Sure. Casey, first, thank you for having us. And my name is Esther Friedman. I was recruited into a group that simply called itself School, but has had many names. And probably the most well-known of those names is OSG, or Odyssey Study Group. That was in 2006. I left in 2011. Now I'm a therapist. Funny thing, I work with former members of cults, live outside of Boston, and I'm a songwriter. So there's my introduction.
And hello, Spencer, probably one of the biggest cheerleaders of my podcast. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Thank you, Casey. I'm happy to be here too. My name is Spencer Schneider. I live in New York. I'm in New York now. I am a lawyer by trade, and I was in the same cult that Esther was in for 23 years, except that I was in the branch in New York and she was in the branch in Boston, and I never knew anybody really who was in Boston. I knew it existed, although they didn't particularly announce it, but I never knew Esther. And the only reason I knew Esther is because she neglected to mention is that the biggest thing that Esther did was she started a blog in, I guess,
2012.
And about the cult. And it was a very important blog because it gave a lot of information about this very secretive group and information that was kept from members. And that blog helped me, sort of planted the seeds for me to get out. I wouldn't say I got out because of it. I didn't. That's not going to do it, folks. I'm sure you all know, but it's helped. I know it's helped a lot of people get out. And so it inspired me to have a blog too. So we both have our own blogs, very different styles. Esther's is very friendly and nice, educational, and mine is very angry, and it's a lot of cursing. That's it. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Spencer. So, Esther, for anybody that hasn't tuned in, and I'm sure the people here today have heard your respective episodes, is it possible, probably not, to give us sort of a brief summary of your experiences in the Odyssey Study Group from the minute you kind of found out about it up to your departure from the group?
Well, I think the briefest summary I can give is that, one day I met a woman in a grocery store who became a new friend. And then the woman in the grocery store, we hung out and took walks and went for coffee. And then one thing led to another. And she said, let me introduce you to some other friends. And then 5 years later, I left a cult. So that's the briefest summary. Casey, I don't know how much, I think I'm going to dovetail a little bit on what Spencer said, because this group was very secretive. And in her invitation, as you will hear later, was, I'd like to introduce you to my friends, but you can't tell anyone about this. It's private just for you. To which I was like, oh, sure, no problem, So that's the briefest summary I can give you.
And Spencer, when you have to compare your story to Esther's, as I kind of said in the opening, it's similar but very different as well. And you have a book to promote, which actually is released next month, which is really, really exciting. How would you summarize your experiences in Odyssey Study Group in a few short sentences?
Very, if I had to I could adopt what Esther said as my own. Really, literally, except that, I joined many years ago. I joined in 1989. I was 29, and I left when I was 52. Similar to Esther, they messed with our lives, our personal lives, and crossed every possible boundary. I know from Esther's experience, they messed with her, marriage. She was married and still is to a wonderful fellow who is not and was not in the cult. I, on the other hand, I also had my relationship messed with. I got married to somebody who was in the cult at the time and remains in the cult. And it was essentially, like an arranged marriage, in the sense that, the leader felt that we would be good together. And we were great friends. It would be like, Esther, you and I are great friends. It would be like if we got married, it's like, okay, I don't know. I like you, you like me, but,
why not?
Friends. Yeah. We're friends, and then you get married, and then it doesn't work out. And we were pressured to stick together, and it just didn't work out. And then and then we were pressured to end it, and it was a mess. But anyway.
So that kind of hijacking of people's relationships and really just the leader making sure that without a doubt she was the person that had all of the control and all of the power over all of the followers at any given point. I mean, there's a few people just in the session today that can probably relate to that kind of pressure over following other people's directions around who to be in a relationship with. It's interesting that some people in the group said yes and some people said no, and then at some point some people said yes up until a point where, you know, the leader would say, okay, so let's do this and then this. And Spencer, there was actually a moment in your book where you were kind of going along with the things that the leader said, and then at one point she suggested one thing and you said, well, actually I think that's a bit too far, which was really interesting for me. And it was something to do with your daughter-in-law.
Yeah, my stepdaughter. If I can tell the quick story real quick, but basically, my ex-wife and I wanted to have a child, and she was, you know, older, and the leader of the group, her name is Sharon Gan. She felt that, you know, my ex was too old to have a child. She wanted her to adopt, and we didn't want to do that. And she suggested to me privately, well, why, you know, my ex-wife has a stepdaughter who at the time was 19, and Sharon suggested to me, well, why don't you just impregnate her? She'll carry the baby, and, you know, then you and Beth can raise the child. It'll be great, you know, and I'm sure your daughter would be totally happy doing that. And I'm like, I remember exactly where I was. I mean, I remember the whole experience, and I was like, I don't think that's a great idea. And that's not something you would say to your cult leader. You know, you don't usually do that. And my first thought was, oh, she's just kind of crazy, you know, whatever. I mean, I thought it was nuts, but I thought, oh, this is just kind of a crazy thing. But, you know, obviously that did not happen. And I didn't leave the group. Despite that, I was still in the group for another 10 years, you know. So it just shows how deep we were, you know, I was in.
And Esther, the person that you're still with today, through all of the trials and tribulations that your relationship faced during your time within the Odyssey Study Group, you were actually pressured to leave this person because they were affecting your commitment to the group at one point. I wondered if you could just kind of briefly talk us through that experience and how this weaponizing of relationships was really, really put onto the members of the group.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, first I have to take a breath and take in what Spencer just said, because that's a story I hadn't heard before. Oh boy. Let me just say I didn't have much exposure to Sharon at all. That's part of my story, is I barely knew about her because I was in Boston, and Boston didn't really inform us that there was a New York school. So I think I'm framing it that way because I think Boston was a little more low key and under, what's the word, coercive. It wasn't, they didn't quite hit you over the head with a hammer for, you know, at least not right away. It was more of a slow boil. But I was in the group for 5 years, and 2.5 years in, I really started losing my mind, honestly. I was coming unraveled, and of course my husband was watching this. And we were fighting, obviously, more and more because the group was taking more and more time. And I guess, long story short, he finally, at a certain point, this was really at the end, he finally found information online about OSG, which is difficult to this day, but was even more difficult back then, and confronted me with this information. And I really was coming unraveled. Like, his timing couldn't have been better, because I was really ready for someone to say, what are you doing? And the headline from that is, he said, very cleverly, are you sure you're not being manipulated? And I was like, I don't know. I mean, honestly, I was like, I don't know my ass from my elbow. Maybe I am being manipulated. But it you know, it was a crack. He got in the crack, and that started to open up. And over the course of the few days after we had that conversation and he confronted me, of course, I was back and forth with some Boston lead teachers, if you want to call them that. And of course it was, your husband is terrible. He's going to keep trying to control you. I can't believe he's done this to you. And, at that point, like what I call my cult coma was kind of cracking. So I was like, who's trying to bully who? Who's trying to control who? My husband, if you ever, Spencer, someday you're going to get to meet Chris. He is a really chill person. Like, he put up with me for 5 years going to this effing group, and you're trying to tell me now that he's trying to control me. So, but, he was getting in the way. And they were, so essentially, I guess the real headline is they said, tell him to mind his own business. And that was the end for me, because I was like, if I tell him to mind his own business, my marriage is over. You can't say that to your spouse, So that was the end of my tenure, really, because I said to the leader, whose name is Robert, I can't do that. And then he said, well, I'm trying to put myself in your husband's shoes. And I said, and then the coma really broke, because I was like, okay, 1 minute before you were telling me he's trying to control me, and now you're trying to pretend like you're empathetic. So, boy, I could fall down this rabbit hole for a while, but I think you get the idea.
I really loved as well. Esther's written a book called The Gentle Soul's Revolution, which I've had the opportunity to read, even though it's what would you say, like pre-publication right now, for sure. Yeah. And the way that you positioned Chris within your writing is exactly how I strive to be as somebody that speaks with survivors of high demand groups, because he was never judgmental. He was never pushy. He was always just very much like asking you open-ended questions that you could just kind of not answer right there and then, but just kind of keep with you for the rest of the, well, am I being manipulated? And he was just absolutely, his line of questioning to you was just, I think the most, the gentlest, but the most clever approach that I have heard of somebody taking with their spouse, because of course, as we know, it isn't always that people, the shelf breaks in that moment for them where they choose between their spouse and the group. A lot of the time it goes in the other direction. And some of the healthiest, most beautiful relationships break down right there and then when the person makes the decision to stay with the group. So in that moment, all of the things that Chris did led to you saying, I know what the right decision is here. And that's a really a beautiful thing that you're still together today after everything that happened. And you mentioned that Sharon was not the leader of your branch, so to speak. I mean, I know she was kind of like the matriarch of the entire operation. So for anybody that hasn't tuned in to the previous interviews with yourselves, Spencer, can you kind of just give us an idea of who Sharon was, and briefly how this group started? And then I'm really interested in kind of how the Boston branch popped up without Sharon really needing to have any influence over that group, because it was all so meticulously done as an operation at that point that she didn't really even ever need to go there. Right.
Well, the history of the group is, some of it is, most of this is secondhand. But it's secondhand, not just from, press, but also from people who were around a long time ago, and also from family members who knew these people. But Sharon Gan's was a New Yorker. She passed away last year. She was 86, or 2 years ago, and she was married, had a couple of kids, was an actress in the 60s of really no major importance whatsoever. She appeared in some shows in Manhattan, And at some point was in the movie Slaughterhouse-Five, the Kurt Vonnegut book, and she had a pretty big part in that. Sometime, I think it was in the early 70s, she met a guy named Alex Horn. And Alex Horn was about 10 years older than her. He was from Chicago, and he fancied himself to be a playwright. I don't know what his actual occupation was, but he had some involvement with a guy named, he had some involvement with people who were considered acolytes of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. I don't know if you folks have heard of him or not, but they were these Russian mystics who created this system called the Fourth Way. And although, there are a lot of Fourth Way organizations that exist, I think they're considered to be like legitimate sort of spiritual groups. My personal view is that it's malarkey. That's a British word, right?
Malarkey, yeah. I mean, John's laughing in the bottom corner there, so he gets it.
Yeah, malarkey. So anyhow, but Alex had some involvement in the group, and he was, like Sharon, a psychopath, and desired nothing more than to exploit people, to make money off of them, to hurt them physically, sexually, and he was a very clever fellow, and very imposing, and they met the match. I mean, although Sharon was married, she met Alex, and she left her family. She literally left her family, and went to California with Alex. And Alex had his own little troupe of people, and he was teaching the Fourth Way, claimed to be a teacher of the Fourth Way. They started a theater company called the Theater of All Possibilities in San Francisco in the 70s. And basically, it was really, they were just trying to put on Alex's plays, which were awful, supposedly. I have his book. They're awful. You can't even imagine. But, I mean, they have interesting titles like Adam West and the Milky Way and all of these cosmic kind of things. And Sharon would star in them. The problem is nobody fucking wanted to go to these shows because they were terrible. So they got all of these people who were in the shows also, mostly like educated people in the Berkeley, San Francisco area, to be in the shows and then get their friends along to help sell tickets for these shows. And what their cult was about was selling tickets to their shows so they could mount their shows. That's what the cult really was. And they took a lot of money from people and stuff like that, and they bought a theater. Then the San Francisco Chronicle in the late set. I'm sorry, is this too long? Is this okay?
No. I feel like you're kind of really painting that picture nicely on how they were able to establish this next part, which you were just to go into.
So I'll get into it because I'm like 3/4 of the way there. But basically, and there's so much more. But basically, in late 70s, the San Francisco Chronicle, which is like the New York Times of New York and San Francisco, is a very well-known paper. It started some kind of, article or investigation of the group because there were allegations of child abuse and sexual abuse and all kinds of things like forced adoptions, forced marriages, forced divorces, fucking with people's private lives, private adoptions, child abuse, sexual abuse, and forced labor, making people sell tickets to their shitty little plays. And then eventually, when this article came out, Sharon and Alex were frightened like hell because this was at the same time that the Jim Jones thing was happening, right, Esther? It was like at about the same time. So they picked up and left San Francisco and came to New York, and they went completely undercover. They regrouped, they started a new group, and they rebranded themselves as a school, as an esoteric school, which is what Gurdjieff said he was doing. And it was all hush, hush, quiet, quiet. So they learned from their mistake and they went underground. Everyone to this day, and it still operates, it has to give an oath of secrecy to go. And they vet people to come. It's like you can't find them if you wanted to. Like if any of you three folks were in the United States and you could not find this group. You can't find it. It's by invitation only. And it's only proffered to people who've already been vetted unwittingly to be, sufficiently have the financial wherewithal to be the type of person who's inquisitive, good-natured. They like people who are really good-natured, who wouldn't like fuck with them. But unfortunately, they fucked with me and Esther, and neither of us are good-natured.
Not anymore.
Yeah, not anymore. I was going to say, yeah, not anymore.
But anyway, so they started in New York, and they grew, and they've had thousands of people in New York. One of their major acolytes came with them from San Francisco. His name is Robert Klein. And at a certain point, I'm not exactly sure why or when, but he was sent from New York to Boston and opened the Boston branch. And, they have their own history of it, but it was separate. Robert was like the second in command of the whole group, right? He was Sharon's second. And, and then at one point early on, Sharon kicked Alex out because he was beating up too many people and he raped a woman. And I think she had the child. I mean, just crazy stuff. And Alex was bad for business. He was really like out there. And Sharon was not, a sexual predator. So she had that going for her. So that's my story. That's the history of this group.
So it's kind of like, and this is the part I found really fascinating from reading Spencer, your work, and then Esther, your work, and comparing the two stories like chronologically. It's almost like you were in the group, Spencer, and then Robert kind of disappeared for a while. And then that's kind of where Esther's story starts. And these two things are unfolding like respectively in different parts of America. And that to me, because you're unknowingly playing kind of the same parts of two different stories, and that to me, I just find that really, really interesting. So Spencer, you didn't really know where Robert had gone, but he'd been with your group long enough to pick up exactly how Sharon ran the sessions, how she expected people to be brought into the group, how she expected people to be kind of vetted, as you said, and so those were all of the things that Robert put in place in Boston that led to Esther being recruited whilst she was picking up supplies to break up with her boyfriend at the time.
Exactly.
Which you will hear about later.
Would you say that that's kind of what happened, do you think?
Well, yes, very close. Yeah. Except I didn't know Robert was up in Boston, because when I met Robert, he'd already shipped off and started the Boston group. When I met him, he would come in New York occasionally to teach. The leaders of the cult were called teachers. Okay. And it was called a second education. So we were like, there was a sort of hierarchical thing right away. But Robert, I didn't know where he was. He came every once in a while to a class. Right. And,
okay.
He's like a nice guy. But I didn't know about Boston until it was like, years. And it was a complete shock that it existed. A total shock. I mean, Esther, you didn't even know New York existed, right?
I did not know about New York till I left.
That's fucking crazy.
So with Spencer, with your story, you're not kind of exposed to Sharon straight away, but then eventually she's kind of drip feeds herself into your sessions, and then she becomes the main focus of your group. Once there's the big unveiling, oh, this is the true leader, and you're all kind of like, well, who is this strange, really bizarre woman? So I thought that was the point, when Sharon had established that she would be taking over the New York group to run the sessions and do all of the wild things in the group, that horrible things that she did. I thought like that's when she'd sent Robert to do his own thing.
No.
Okay.
It's close enough. It's close. It's very close. She didn't make an appearance for a year because we were kind of groomed and ready to meet her, because frankly, she's a kind of shocking person. And I think she knew that she also didn't want to deal with people and groom them, because grooming is like, you have to be very love bombing and doing all that stuff. And that was like she didn't want to do that. That was not, she
Yeah.
wasn't good at it. She didn't want to do it. She was too, whatever. So she had her minions do all that. And then we met her after a year. I had no idea she existed. And then we were told she's the leader. We're like, what? So, but I think, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So Esther, it's not Robert that you meet initially either into your kind of, it's very clever how they funnel everybody in and then kind of have people exposed to the top of the pyramid or the hierarchy, so to speak. So can you kind of talk us through your experiences, not with Sharon specifically, but with Robert as the leader of your branch?
Yeah, well, I can say that my recruiter did introduce me to Robert at the tail end, for him to do the final vetting. Of course, I didn't know that was what was happening at the time. Robert, give me a second to get my thoughts together here. He does not come across as insane. He seems, I don't know, maybe a little eccentric. Some people found him a little creepy at first, but he's very well spoken. He's very articulate. He's kind of professorial looking, like the tweed jacket. You almost expect him to break out a pipe. And in that way, because I think that the name of the group was simply school, he kind of fit the bill to lead, so he would come in with these ideas, the fourth way ideas, which, by the way, no one ever mentioned the fourth way or Gurdjieff in my group.
Oh, yes, of course. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was completely left out. Oh, we're just studying these ancient esoteric schools and oral teaching, passed down from teacher to student over the years. Nobody mentioned all the books that were published. So Robert comes in with all this alleged knowledge, right? He's talking about these ideas. And he's quite good at, he could have been a professor. He's very good at explaining things. And it wasn't, at first the love bombing, it's kind of subtle. Like, I wouldn't have called it love bombing, He has a good sense of humor, unlike, most narcissistic, sociopathic people. They usually don't have good humors because they take themselves so seriously. So I would say it was in my experience, about 2.5 years in when I started seeing this other side of Robert come out more consistently, where, he could be very biting. He could be very sarcastic. He could dismiss you with a look. And so I think, it's that frog in the pot analogy where if you're in that environment long enough and everyone's treating him like the end all be all, you think he's the end all be all and that he knows everything. So I hope that answers your question, Casey.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd completely forgotten that with Spencer's experience, they knew that it was Gurdjieff that they were studying. And then with your group, they just never told you where the information came from. So you just thought that there was like some person with all of these like really strange, like in somewhat progressive kind of, and then the study material that you were given, anytime Gurdjieff or Ouspensky's or anybody else's names were mentioned, they were all blocked out. So somebody had been through all of these documents and like systematically, well, I wonder why they just decided to not tell any of you that was.
There's a good reason. Can I jump in?
I'd love to do this, actually. Go ahead, Spencer.
It's very simple. When I joined, there was no internet. Okay. And there was nothing on, there was no internet. So Gurdjieff, okay, big deal. So, you wouldn't know shit about Gurdjieff. You go to a bookstore and there's Gurdjieff books and whatever. And they actually said, don't read books about him. You could read the books that he's written. Right. And naturally, I did try to find out a lot about him, but there was not a lot to find out. So, but when the internet started, Oh, I think they stopped using the Gurdjieff name in about 2001, because in 2001 is when Rick Ross, who is a cult expert who you've heard of, right? Rick Ross published stuff about Sharon online. And so we had been forbidden from looking online. Of course, I didn't obey that. And I looked and I saw it, although it had very little impact on me. I thought it was just, angry bloggers, right? I didn't think much of it. But starting then, they decided not to tell people Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, because if people looked up Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, they'd see this website. And so that's what they did. And
that explains a lot.
Right. But it's even more now. I mean, I've learned, and Esther, I've told you this, that right now what they do is they don't give out any reading materials at all. They purely just talk about these, Gurdjieff ideas and, as their own. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, is it, it's extremely deceptive, and it's designed to keep them secret. And, they don't use last names and stuff. So that's the deal with that.
That answers it so well. I mean, I was reading Esther's work and I was like, why? But that makes sense. I suppose now you could just type in one line from a book, and the internet is so clever that it would be able to tell you exactly where that came from.
Yeah. And, I think just to give our folks here a sense of how far they took this, they actually Xeroxed an entire book, and a published book, and redacted the names with whiteout, and bound it in a black cover. They called it the Black Book, and handed it out and told us that they were transcribed lectures. Whoever transcribed these lectures had a remarkable memory, because, so that's how crazy it was.
I thought that they were kind of, I don't know, I thought maybe Sharon had thought of some weird social experiment that she wanted to do with the Boston group by not telling them where the information came. But I don't know why it makes so much sense what Spencer said, but in my head I just came up with that answer, that they must just be trying something different out with the Boston group. And you do mention in your writing, Esther, that you met Robert, you came to know Robert, and then there's this session all of a sudden one night where he's acting kind of a bit different, and then in walks this short round woman with orange hair. And Robert's kind of all like, oh, what can I do for you? Here, let me take your hand, let me walk you. And it turns out that this person that he's with, Sharon, has decided to come and grace the Boston branch with her presence.
Yeah, she graced us with her presence maybe 2 or 3 times. And each time I thought to myself, who is this crazy woman? Like, who's the nutcase? And, everyone was acting weird. I think that the older class, so to speak, because the way the hierarchy was that there was younger students and older students. And at the time I was a younger student. It was, maybe several months into my tenure. She, actually, Robert waltzed her in on his arm, and he was like beaming at her, which was weird in and of itself, because everyone always propped him up. So I was like, oh my God, Robert's beaming at this crazy lady. Like, she looks nutty to me. She's got too much makeup on, and these flowy like scarves, and and then he kind of deposited her in this special chair at the front of the room, and turned around to the class, and he swept his arm like this and went, ask your questions. He didn't introduce her. I'm like, who the fuck is this person? And then everyone stood up, and we had to stand up to ask questions, kind of like akin to raising your hand when you're in grade school, So people who wanted to ask Sharon for her blessing or for some guidance stood up, and she called on people. And I was like, this is word salad. I mean, I can't tell you how confused I was. I was like, why are we asking this crazy lady our questions? No one told me who she was. So that was my, pretty much my experience of Sharon. And then she disappeared.
And was it your experience, Esther, where somebody, or maybe it was yours, Spencer, where somebody spoke out to Sharon saying that they had heard voices, or they heard somebody telling them?
I think this is in my class.
And then her reaction was kind of very different again to what you'd all experienced in class up to that point.
Well, because Boston was not as, I think, my impression is Boston is just a lot more, God, what's the word? Insidious, not as hard-hitting.
Cutthroat, I think. Yeah, the New York branch was kind of, I feel like when you read Spencer's work, every school session was like I don't know, like a near-death experience almost. I know that sounds dramatic, but some of the experience that Spencer writes about in his book, that's how it comes across.
There was no class. I didn't go to any class where there wasn't some intense public humiliation and major involvement, with people's lives and some outrage. Where
that's different than Boston. I mean, Boston, we certainly had that, but it wasn't every class. In fact, some of the classes were just fucking boring, But this is Sharon's first visit, and I'm sitting there thinking, who's the nutcase? And no one's telling me who she is, but she's suddenly answering everyone's questions. And one woman got up. I'm not even sure she had a question, but she started talking about yoga and hearing angels. And Sharon ripped her a new one. And this was my first experience actually seeing somebody act like this in school. She was like, what do you mean you hear angels? I've been doing this work for 40 years. I've never heard angels. And she kicked her out. You're lying. You should just leave. And I was new enough in the group. I almost left at that point, honestly. But we had what we called sustainers, which were really minders, and she kind of talked me into not leaving, but I was ready to leave because I was like, that was too weird for me.
It kind of it explains a little bit of Sharon's MO though, and how the New York sessions would have played out. She came to Boston, and the first kind of the way she presents herself is exactly what the New York branch would have been experiencing every single time they had an interaction with her. And I feel like that kind of again intersects both of your worlds really nicely in a way that you can kind of, oh, okay, so this is just how Sharon is to everyone, just a really cruel human being, super manipulative. And towards the end of your tenure in the group, Spencer, just kind of such a big woman that she had to just lay in this lazy boy chair and dictate all of her orders out to everyone without actually ever being able to really be mobile in the sessions.
Sharon thought of herself like she was a queen from a Shakespeare play, and that she lived a life of tragedy and drama and intrigue. And in her mind, she was like royalty, and she demanded that her subjects treat her like, real royalty is not treated, this sort of imaginary situation. So, like Esther is describing, people would have to stand, and she could just lose her temper, and you had to deal with it. And she could lose her temper, or she could be lovely. But basically, she dressed the part, like in these flowing dresses, and she would demand that, everything was taken care of her, so that, when she came into what we call class, she would be seated at the front of the class on top of a riser, a pedestal, literal pedestal, right? And it'd be like a lazy boy set up, a leather lazy boy, where she would sit down and sort of plop herself down and kick back and lead the group. And someone often would give her a massage while she was there, laying back. Sometimes Robert did, if he was in New York. but usually it was another teacher. And people would be bringing up coffee or drinks and lighting up cigarettes for her, whatever. And that was her whole life. People from the cult tended to her like that. I mean, it went all the way from lighting her cigarette to buying her an apartment at the Plaza Hotel in New York for $8.5 million. I mean, this is the way she lived. She had a home in the Hamptons. She had a home in Mexico. She had Montana, upstate New York. It was, quite an empire. And that's the way she lived. That's the way she wanted to live in her mind. And, that was it.
And her home in the Hamptons was actually something that I briefly wanted to touch on just before we go into how you two actually managed to connect together and what it was like to learn about each other's kind of existence and those respective groups. So it's my understanding, Spencer, that her home in the Hamptons that she had with Alex at first, I believe, was built solely on labor trafficking from followers and people that were in the group.
Yes, it was an existing home, and but it was completely remodeled by folks actually from Boston that came down from Boston to Long Island, which is a several-hour short trip. It was purchased through laundered money.
What was the name of the thing again? I'll just pop a link into the chat so everybody can have a look. Because I think you can view the property now online. Is that right? They host weddings and things there?
Oh, that place. Oh, that's in Montana.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
that's a totally different place.
Yeah.
But yeah, do you want me to give you the link for that? I could.
Yes, please. So sorry about that. I'm just confused
Falls.
between her properties. So there's this beautiful ranch type property in Montana amongst the picturesque rolling hills and there's cabins and all sorts.
Yeah, you can show that. That would be great. So when they got kicked out of California on the way to New York, they stopped off in Montana, which is close to California, and it's very remote and near in the Rocky Mountains. And they purchased 125 acre property, and I'm told Alex and Sharon bought it with cash. You don't buy things with cash. Like, it's just not normal, but they had all this cash. They bought the property, and they brought people from New York to build 7 log cabins. And that was built in the middle of winter. These people were not paid. In fact, they were paying to be members of the cult. And I spoke to one of the guys who did it, and it was like 3 people originally, and then they brought in a few more people, but they worked, night and day in really tough conditions. Then they built out the property for her. And then when I came to to this place later on, we built this huge a building that was to be used as a theater for Sharon in the woods. It had an indoor pool. It was over the top. This place was pretty luxurious. And to go there, it was only a few of the students. There it is. Yeah. Falls Creek Ranch. If you open it, will it show on the screen, Esther?
I think it
Oh, it'll just be like in a separate thing.
Yeah, so if everybody wants to click on it and have a look at it in their web browsers, and this is kind of how it exists today, still what it looked like after it was finished being built.
Yeah, if you click under cabins on Falls Creek Ranch, eventually the property was sold. Sharon was forced into selling it, and now it was bought by a family, and they rent out some of the cabins, and you could stay there for $165 a night.
I just wonder if the current owners know the circumstances on which all of those cabins were built.
I wrote to them, and I said, by the way, I used to go there. I helped build it, and I was in the cult, and they didn't write back to me. I guess they didn't want to hear about it.
Wow.
But the former what is it called? Caretaker they live down the road from this building, and I'm friendly with them now, and they're very nice people, and they didn't really understand that Sharon was a cult leader, and now they do, and they had a falling out with her, and they are, they're hip to it. But if you go on to that website and you hit under cabins, you can see pictures of those buildings that were built by slave labor.
So, Esther, you knew that the New York branch existed, but you hadn't been up there. And Spencer, you hadn't. Oh, so neither of you knew that.
I did not know about the New York branch at all until I left.
And Spencer, you had no idea that the Boston branch existed.
I didn't at first, but I found out because things were a little looser in the 90s, and we were sort of informed about them indirectly, but I never went up there. I met some of the people up there, but not all of them.
Okay. So the two of you didn't connect until you'd both left the Odyssey Study Group completely.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And Esther, what was that first introduction like for you to realize that first of all, that there was an entire other branch that existed, the kind of original group. And secondly, that there were other people that were kind of ready to speak out about their experiences?
Well, it was surreal because I was being kind of pummeled, getting an onslaught of information that I had spent 5 years in a group and I had no idea what I was in, none whatsoever, So I leave the group because of this information that my husband finds online, including a website that doesn't exist anymore called Esoteric Freedom. And I reached out to the woman who started that website, and that is when I start learning that there's this whole other branch in New York that I like to call corporate headquarters because it's Sharon, and where Boston is what I like to call the poor cousin, because apparently, according to some of the New York people that I spoke with, New York looks down on Boston because Boston is not the original. And so just the kind of onslaught of realizing how much they kept from me, and that there was this hierarchy that, in the when I first entered school, it was pitched to me as this very casual group. It was like, okay, what's with the hierarchy, and what's with the secretiveness, So I have to tell you, the woman who built that website, Esoteric Freedom, once had a gathering at her house shortly after I left, and contacted her, and I met all these people from New York, and I think I was in such a state of shock that there were all these people that not only knew about this group, but they were in another branch, and they were telling me things about the group that I wasn't supposed to know, that I barely remember the night. It was just this like sea of faces telling me things that were not at all what I had been told. the polar opposite, right? This was supposed to be an esoteric school of thought. We were all supposed to be bettering ourselves, and it was the opposite. So was one more piece of like, I think betrayal I just felt betrayed, because I realized like this whole thing was a ruse. It was a deception from start to finish.
And Spencer, you mentioned that you came across Esther's blog, and that was one of the things that was a catalyst for you eventually leaving the group altogether. But it isn't what kind of swayed you immediately.
Yeah, it helped a lot because I was kind of I wanted to find a way out at that point. I was very unhappy. But I never had any intention of leaving. I was just hoping I would stay until Sharon died or something like that. But Esther's blog was really helpful because her writing was very soulful and authentic. and she wrote really about like her experience. And it wasn't preachy, she wasn't like, preaching about like what the problems are and whatnot. It was a little bit, explaining, her situation, but I never felt like there was like this violent push. And I think that's important for people who are in cults to be, not, because that's kind of like what you're inundated by. You're told like everybody hates us and everybody thinks we're bad, and this us versus them mentality. But so Esther had a very gentle, what is her thing called? The Gentle Souls Revolution. It had a very gentle voice about it, and it was helpful. And then when I finally did leave, I did reach out, I think directly to Esther. I think I did. I don't remember exactly when we became friends.
I don't remember either, honestly.
We became friends very quickly because I reached out to as many people as I could after I left. So.
Mm-hmm. Do either of you remember sort of any striking similarities or differences that have stayed with you since kind of connecting initially with one another?
Well, it was like we had the same abusive parents, but we were in different households. It was really the same thing.
Wow.
It was like a nutty mom who went from house to house and tortured us both.
Yeah, but in my case, she just showed up a few times.
Right, but she had that Robert there, and I had Robert too, and he was nuts. He was really harsh in New York when he came, but they were just harsh, and it was the same, type of methodology to brainwash us and gaslight us and coerce us, and they really wanted the same things, which was, continuation. Like, I actually think, Esther and Casey, that this group is a lot more like, in a certain way, like the multi-level marketing groups, because it relies very much on this recruiting and kind of always putting somebody else behind you so much, because there's only so much they could squeeze out of people. There's some people who stay there for many, 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 many years, but most people don't. Most people stay for a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. So they got to get other people in. So they're constantly recruiting. And it's like a pyramid scheme like that, I think. Does that sound right to you, Esther?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, not only do most people leave after a couple of years, the ones that stay, they're exhausted, right?
Right.
Like how much you can't squeeze water from a stone. So, they have to keep bringing people on in.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And even though there was that expose that was written about Sharon and Alex years before, which kind of caused their move and their rebrand, Sharon's MO never really changed by the sounds of things. There was still the private adoptions. There was still the kind of enforcing people to divorce or marry, a lot of kind of coercing people to do work for them. And, instead of getting people to sell tickets to their theatre shows, she was getting people to build her properties for her instead. So it kind of sounds like even though she moved on, she kind of stayed the same.
Yeah, I mean, yes, but, it was heavy duty what she did to people. It wasn't just like, bossing them around and telling them like who to get married and stuff like that. I mean, it was, out and out sexual abuse, having people have sex with other people against their will, mostly with women. She really did not like women. She would tell people during class to leave and have sex with a random guy, and people did it. She told me to have sex with my daughter. Maybe somebody else did that. I don't know. I know that other leaders there absolutely abused women and used their power of authority to force themselves on other women. And then there was all the financial crimes that of money laundering, and we paid in cash. And, it was used to buy properties. They put people they made people to be middlemen of, cleaning money for them. Sharon had pieces of legitimate businesses. It was pretty heavy duty, and she ruined a lot of people's lives. A lot of these adoptions also were, were I don't know
coerced.
There was absolutely one situation where I spoke to somebody where his child was taken away from them because Sharon and Alex told them that the parents told them that they would be horrible parents, and she convinced them to give up the child. The child was given to the son of a very well-known movie star. But here's the thing: a lot of the kids were not told that they were adopted, and it would be like, like if you gave up your child to like a friend of yours, and you never told, and the child was never told. I mean, that's what happened, literally. Sharon was a big believer of gay conversion, which is that there's no such thing as gay conversion. It'd be like saying, I could convert from Judaism to Catholicism, but I can't convert from being, I guess you can convert to certain things, but you can't convert your sexuality, But she believed in, so she would marry off gay men to straight women. And a lot of men, there are a lot of people who have a lot of shame about it. It was a different period. It wasn't quite like now. She married her own daughter off to a gay man. I mean, this was, we all thought it was a great thing.
I think it was, Esther, in your writing as well, where you called it cult light. Am I right in thinking that that's your writing? So the thing that I thought was interesting around our discussion that you'd written that was that you kind of compared it to NXIVM, and you said, that's what you would call cult dark. Yeah. And in comparison, your experience is cult light. But then in Spencer's writing, he wrote that somebody said that they would kill for Sharon. So if she wanted it to get to the point that NXIVM got to, where you talk about this multi-level marketing and how you can compare it to that, it very easily actually could have transpired. So yeah, I just thought that was an interesting thing. I mean, if Sharon really wanted it to get to that level, I'm sure that it would have gone to that level after.
It could have. Not everybody would have done it, but plenty of people would have. I mean, there was a couple of guys. One guy told me he would kill for her. Sharon told me that somebody else told her that he would take a bullet for her. And there was another guy who was totally willing to go to jail for charity fraud. And I was like, yeah, I would go to jail for certain things, but I wouldn't go to jail for anything.
And you're a lawyer, so, you should know, like.
I would definitely not go to jail for anything. There's nothing I would go to jail. There's no cause.
So we have, for this final section before we go into the Q&A, Esther and Spencer have both agreed to read a short section from both of their books. And they have chosen between the two of them to read a small section from their work about their individual experiences being recruited into the Odyssey Study Group. So we will have those readings from the two of them, and then we'll go into our Q&A section. So Esther, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, sure. So let me give you a little bit of context. At this point, let's just say my life wasn't going so great at this point. Let's see, Boston, springtime, constantly raining, breaking up in a relationship, just feeling completely lost in my life. Okay, that's the context. And I think it's important to say that my relationship history was not so auspicious, and I really wanted, if we were going to break up, I really wanted it to be grown up. So I actually offered, I was like, soon to be ex-boyfriend, come over tonight, I'll buy us what I'm calling breakup snacks. So I'm at the Whole Food buying the breakup snacks, feeling sorry for myself because nothing's going well, waiting in line. While in line, there's a family behind me. Woman asks me a question. She's there with her kids, engages me in conversation, and the conversation ends with, "Hey, I've really enjoyed talking to you. We should get together," and we exchange phone numbers, okay? And I guess the other thing to say is that this is not a typical scene in Boston. Like, people in Boston don't strike up conversations in the cashier line. So I was both suspicious, but she also snapped me out of my morass. Okay, so go home. Soon-to-be ex-boyfriend blows off the summit, okay? And I'm going to start from there. I ate the breakup snacks and got busy falling apart, feeling old and lost and crappy. The rain fell in torrents and I wept with the sky. I was constantly crying. My pain far outweighed the significance of the relationship. Every failure and loss up to that point manifested into teardrops. Obviously, I was clinically depressed and should have looked for help. But at this point, I had had therapy. I even had a master's degree in expressive art therapy. Nothing changed. I didn't know what to believe. Elise called persistently. This is the woman after we exchanged phone numbers, right? I returned her calls slowly, but Elise never answered her phone. I decided she must be a very busy woman. One day she called, I answered, and we scheduled a meeting, and I had a new friend. Over several months, we took walks, drank coffee, visited museums, and met for lunch. She asked questions, and I answered them. My anxiety poured out unchecked. She listened and revealed just enough. Was I suspicious? Yes. Did my need for validation override those suspicions? Yes. The balance felt uncomfortable, though, and one day I said, I don't know what it is about you, Elise. I talk so much about myself when I'm with you. That's good, isn't it? She asked. It's different. What about you? I asked. How did you meet your husband? She paused, shifted in her chair, and looked down. We met at an acting class, she responded. It's hard to explain. Then she changed the subject. I thought that was odd, but I didn't want to make my new friend uncomfortable, so I followed her lead. Elise had a gentle presence, a compassionate ear, and a good sense of humor. We laughed a lot. We pondered the Egyptian pyramids and other global mysteries. I felt understood, and I grew to trust her. One day I asked, and I'm not kidding, I really did ask this, the quintessential question, is this all there is? There has to be more to life than this. Elise seized the moment. It was go time. How would you like to meet other people who also ponder such questions? She said that she got together with friends on Tuesday and Thursday night to discuss ideas. It was fun. They laughed a lot. People would come and go. I envisioned a casual gathering, lively discussions with a group of friends in a private home, laughing over a potluck dinner. It couldn't hurt, I thought, so I replied, sure. Elise looked relieved. She then shifted in her chair and leaned closer to say, there's one more thing. It's very important that you not tell anyone about this. It's private, just for you. Suspicions poked me inside, but I trusted Elise. Her private nature was a little odd, but our connection had developed over the months. She'd been kind. We laughed together. I had no reason to suspect that she was setting me up for cult membership. Additionally, the private just for you invitation was intriguing and seductive. I was curious, and I felt special that she had chosen me to meet her other friends. We made plans, and I didn't tell anyone as instructed, and I waited for the next meeting. The end.
That was great. Thank you so much, Esther. And I thought it was really interesting to watch Spencer shaking his head there at certain points as well during that reading. So Spencer, would you please honour us with your reading from your book that does release next month in July?
Yeah, July 5th. If anybody orders it, send me your email your address and I'll mail you a book plate if you buy
Fantastic.
it. Fantastic. And you'll get one. My email address, Casey has it. So, oh shoot. So what am I going to read here?
About recruitment. Mine was the 2006 recruitment, and Spencer's is 1989 recruitment. So we thought it would be interesting to do the compare and contrast.
Yeah, so I'll do the same thing. So I was 29. I was living in Manhattan. I was an attorney, and I was also playing in a band at the time because I'm a bass player, and I was playing in this band in this bar, and it was kind of like to, I just wanted other outlets in my life besides just working, very, very long hours. And this was like sort of a hobby of mine to play in bands. And I played at this like bar in lower part of Manhattan. And I sort of struck up a friendship with a bartender there whose name was Bruce. And he went to, I forgot what school. He went to like undergrad, he went to Harvard, and then he was studying on the weekends. He was studying to be an architect at Columbia, like two really great schools in the US. And he was working at a bar at night, and he was very friendly, he was very nice. And we just chatted all the time. And then all of a sudden he started like calling me and wanting to get together, which was a little out of place because I saw him at the bar. There's no reason to get together. And I mean, he showed up once like near my office and said, let's go for lunch. And we had lunch, and he would ask me like personal questions about my life. And, it was very flattering and nice, but I was kind of busy. I just didn't have too much time for that. But I was always curious and liked what his interest. And then one time he called me, he said, look, you got to meet me downtown. I've got to tell you something that's very important. I was thinking, all right, let me just go. I'm very curious, but maybe I could just put an end to this. So I met him at this bar in the Village. After the waitress took our order, I asked, okay, Bruce, what's all the cloak and dagger? He started slowly in a soft, wavering voice, looking right at me. There's something I need to speak with you about. It's not something I've ever told anyone. I rolled my eyes and I wondered, why me? I said, it's okay. Are you about to come out to me? No, he said, blushing. The waitress brought our drinks, giving us both a chance to reset, take a sip, and light up cigarettes. I looked past him over his shoulder to the front room, and the thin rays of light. Bruce's face was blurry in our smoke. And for a moment, I didn't know where I was. I took a deep drag. He did too. The smoke billowed over the table. The nicotine filled my brain, relaxing me. My heartbeat accelerated with my curiosity. Bruce shifted to a formal tone, slowly explaining, I didn't mean to alarm you, but there's some timing issue. So I want to get hold of you. It's something I deeply cherish. Cherish? And that's why I never discuss it. But I've got to ask if you can keep this between us and not talk about it with anyone. He waited and I shrugged. Sure, but who would I tell? Well, I don't mean just Joel or the band, but anyone. It's private, he said. By now, I was dying to hear what he had to tell me. We lit up new cigarettes. Bruce continued solemnly, choosing each word carefully. I'm a student of a school. It's an esoteric school that is hidden. It's invisible. That's why we've got to keep this private. I'm listening. These schools have existed since ancient times. Their knowledge has been passed down orally from generation to generation. Its focus is the meaning of life, how to find truth, inner freedom. He could see my face, body pulling back. He assured me, they're not bullshit, but they aren't for everyone. It's been said that Shakespeare was in a school. Even the philosophers and artists we mentioned, Plato, Rembrandt, and Frank Lloyd Wright in modern times. This sounds even more super sketchy, exciting, and dangerous. Now, Bruce continued, the school that exists in New York is the only one of its kind here, and it traces its roots directly to ancient times. It sounds like he's going to invite me. I'm telling you because there's an opportunity for new people to study. This opening doesn't happen much. It's closing soon. Now this sounded rehearsed. it was helping. It has helped me to get the things I want in life. I know you want to get something out of your life rather than just your work. With that, Bruce studied my face while he took a drag of his Marlboro Light with a shaky hand. What do you think? There's a month-long period, an experiment, where you can come to class and try it out. He flicked the ashes in the small round ashtray. And, I could keep reading, but basically I thought it was, I told him I wasn't interested. I told him it sounded like a cult, and I had no interest in it whatsoever. And I left. And then I felt really guilty. I went home. I felt really guilty about saying that to him because he was a nice guy. He was like pouring his heart out to me, for God's sakes. He never told anybody about this. I mean, it was like very intense, and I felt like I was being a dick. So I called him and we met, and he convinced me to come to a meeting, and the rest of it you could read. And
23 years later. Wow. Thank you so much, both of you, for reading those extracts. I'm sure that everybody else listening found it interesting to kind of hear the similarities, and even though they were many years apart when you were both recruited, it's again those methods that are tried and tested and just honed over time to just be as effective as possible, up to the point where Esther's kind of brought into it a few years later in the other group. So absolutely fascinating stuff to just hear you both kind of compare and contrast your experiences. So now I'm going to unmute everybody and we can have our little question and answer session for the next 15 minutes or so. And this part I won't include in the final edit. So I will just say thank you both so much for your time. Spencer, I wish you the best of luck with your book launch next month. I know it's going to be spectacular. And Esther, I'm so excited for you to have your book picked up in the very near future, and for everybody else here to have the chance to read The Gentle Soul's Revolution as well. I appreciate you both so much, and thank you both for your time today.
Thanks for having us, Casey. Always a pleasure.
Love you, Casey. You're the best. Really. So good.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault Podcast.